So here's the book that came out just a week ago. It's called The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. Now, what's strikingly scary in a way is how events that took place 100 years ago speak so clearly to current events. And actually, I think that's the power of the historian, is to show how what was more explicit then can still be now a key of critical discussion of what's going on at present. So I'm going to go on in defining austerity. And I want to say that austerity, while the American public is also always focused on the geopolitical conflicts between, the opposition between the United States and Russia and the humanitarian war for Ukraine. Actually, what we see is that this conflict is quite interestingly combined with a fundamental agreement on the type of unilateral class warfare that goes on within each country, right? So the attention that we have about how countries are at war with one another and how, all of this rhetoric about how we are united against the evil actually is a way to hide the fact that we are not united at all as regards to what happens within the countries, that we live in an economic system, capitalism, which is a classist system, and is perpetuated only if the capital order is maintained. So this is a first key element, is to realize that a lot of what we hear in the media is also to take away attention from what you're pointing out, which is the fact that curbing inflation via austerity is something that harms specific sectors of society, specifically the majority of us working people. So let me define austerity and then get to what's the real purpose of austerity here, which is something that is illuminated by what went on exactly 100 years ago in Europe as well as in the United States. Austerity is usually understood as just about cutting expenditures, broadly speaking, at the macro level. I think this is a wrong definition of what austerity is because it tends to depoliticize austerity. Austerity, of course, it's about fiscal austerity. So, of course, it's about cutting where the state decides to spend, but it's about cutting specific sectors. So the fact that the United States is not cutting the budget, generally speaking, because it's actually spending more. This is of 2021, more than 800 billion in the military sector. Does not mean that there is no austerity, because if you look at what happens in the social sector, you see, for example, that barely 66 billion are spent on education, kindergarten through 12th grade, and that there is structural underfunding of any social benefits, starting from Medicaid, Medicare, and so forth. So the issue here is where the state decides to spend. And structurally speaking, the United States has been experiencing austerity for, I would say, the last 50 years. And what you constantly see is shifting of resources away from the social sector, from school, healthcare, services in general, cutting the benefits for people. So structurally underfunded. And this is something that actually now we know that even and this is something, again, that unites supposed conflicting parties. So even the Democrats and the Republicans, supposedly so antagonistic for what regards national policies, are quite in a way in agreement with the fact that there needs to be a structural underfunding of the social sector, especially right now that inflation supposedly is so high. So it's about where you spend. It's about how the state gets its money, so the revenue of the state. And austerity is about regressive taxation. So the fact that the majority of us pays proportionally much more taxes than the minority. And this is actually something that all the people at the top realize, that actually consumption taxes are constantly increased, while, for example, corporate taxes are cut. Last cut happened with the Trump administration. So cut of taxes at the top and increasing taxes for the majority. Then there's monetary austerity. So that's fiscal austerity, what I just described. But austerity is actually a trinity. So we have monetary austerity, which is all about what we're seeing everywhere today, which is the increases in interest rates. Increases in interest rates makes money dear, and this means that it's going to be more expensive for the normal person to borrow. And we know that the majority of Americans live off of debt because they can actually not afford to get at the end of the month otherwise. But increases in interest rates has a much more structural result, which is that of slowing down the economy, because it's more expensive to borrow also for businesses, which then slow down their investment. And thus, the immediate result of increases in interest rates is a hike in unemployment. And this hike in unemployment has, as a result, the curbing of the bargaining power of the workers, and thus, of course, the fact that it is possible to repress wages. Finally, and I'll get back to this in a minute, finally, there's directly industrial austerity. That's the third element of the Trinity, which is direct attack on organized labor, curtailment of union benefits, privatization, which increases the competition for workers to have to participate in private businesses for getting employed. Now, why is austerity so important right now? Well, I think it's enough to look at what's going on at the level of the labor market. In fact, economists are increasing interest rates with the explicit purpose of cooling down the economy, which means that they are trying to make the labor market less tight, which means, again, that they're trying to cure a fundamental disorder that they are seeing in our society right now. And what is this disorder? It's the disorder of capital, again, the title of the book, as a social relation of production. And I'm going to explain this in very simple words. For our economy to work, our capitalist economy to work, the majority of us has to go and work for a wage in order to survive. We need to have no other option in order to buy a sandwich, pay for rent, go to school, but to actually get employed for a certain amount of money that goes into our pockets. Now, lately, interestingly enough, in the past year, we've been seeing a shaking of this capital order, this social relation, by the fact that we have to sell our labor power. And it's coming in the fact that there has been, for example, starting from already from March of 2021, we saw the phenomenon of the Great Resignation, by which a lot of workers resigned from their jobs. And now it's really fascinating to see that there are 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed. 10 years ago, there were almost 4 people fighting for 1 job. So we see the real reversal. So again, I'll repeat, almost 2 jobs per 1 person right now, while 10 years ago, we had 4 people fighting for 1 job opening. So we see really here how the power relations within the labor market have been, in a way, favorable to the workers in the past year. And right now, we not only see an average hourly earnings go up by 4.7% in the last year, and just this month, there was just the release of the report of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Just this month, wages, nominal wages actually increased by 0.4%. But the point is that this increases in nominal wages go hand in hand with much greater labor militancy. So not only people are giving up participating in the labor market because they're kind of fed up of having to work for such low wages, and there's all these job openings which are not taken. And this means that there's greater competition amongst employers to attract workers, which brings up wages. But these wages going up is also the effect of labor militancy. There's a lot of strikes going on in our country at this moment. There's a really cool resource that I would like people to know of. It's this labor action tracker from Cornell University that you find online, and it gives you real time all the labor disputes that are going on. And at the current moment, we have 621 labor actions in 949 locations.
Wow.
And
I mean, yeah, it certainly feels significant. And I mean, the argument that you make is that the effect of all of this austerity on labor, on declining, either directly interfering with labor activity or to diminish the power of workers because there's more competition for wages, is that it is a feature, not a bug. And that is an innovation that came about precisely because in the post-World War I era, you had a society where the government had intervened for the war cause and taken over many of the means of production that most people, a disproportionate number of people were employed by the government. And people were experiencing increased labor power, their ability to advocate for higher wages, et cetera. And the kind of mythology of how the capital order had been operating into that point started to have cracks in it. Is that right?
Absolutely. Definitely. So this is the thing. This is when austerity becomes a necessity for the preservation of our socioeconomic system. And this is when experts in power, high-powered experts, are there to advise and implement austerity all around, actually the globe also at present, is when the dominant ideology, our consensus towards the system is breaking down. And when does it break down? It breaks down when inflation is very high. And 100 years ago, during the revolutionary years, 1918, 1920, people were really envisaging alternative ways of organizing society. So there were many claims for economic democracy. This was not just in the abstract, it was quite concrete in the sense that people were finding ways to organize production distribution that would overcome the capital order, overcome the fact that the majority had to just sell their labor power for a wage. And instead of wage relations, they were thinking about, for example, the sovereignty of the workers through self-management, workers' councils, co-ops, different understandings of how we could imagine our future. And it is in this moment in which the capital order is shaken because people realize that capitalism is not a natural given, is not a necessity. It's something that constantly needs protection, and you can actually subvert it. It is in this moment that the role of austerity is crucial to preserve the status quo. And right now we see it again because just at the New School where I actually teach, there's a big strike and there's a lot of solidarity. And the inflationary spiral that we're seeing, inflation so high, is triggering greater workers' militancy. So that's why experts are so fearful of inflation. It's because inflation is not just an economic problem, it is fundamentally a political problem because it leads people to question the efficiency of our market economy and thus ignites greater workers' unrest. And, workers, when they organize, they can get results. And these results don't necessarily mean just increases in wages. It's also about thinking about different ways, again, to organize our society. And this is what austerity really has to curtail and foreclose.
I'm so glad you brought that up because this is an opportunely timed conversation because just a few days ago, Barack Obama gave an interview to Trevor Noah on The Daily Show. And I don't think that there was any intention of the interview touching on topics like the comparative merits of capitalism, socialism, or any other economic theory. But I suspect that Trevor Noah has a little bit of politics. He has a little bit of leftist in him. And at some point, he asked Barack Obama whether or not he felt like capitalism, compassionate capitalism, I think was the term that Obama had used, was really the best way to go about things. And I wondered if it's just about a little under 2-minute clip. I wondered if you could listen to it and give me your thoughts and kind of apply some of the things that you've been talking about to this worldview. I think that's very much shared by a lot of people, but set out quite clearly by Barack Obama here.
I wonder, though, do you think inclusive capitalism is somewhat of a paradox? It feels like
it's possible.
It feels you think it's because it feels like capitalism is designed to extract as much wealth as possible from every single interaction that it can.
Look, I mentioned Sweden and some of the problems they're having because of immigration. On the other hand, you look at Scandinavian countries; they're capitalist countries.
But some people would argue,
and those work very well.
But some people would argue that their foundation is more, socialist, and then they go with, it's almost like they go, we're socialist first, and then capitalism is our undercurrent.
Not really.
You don't agree with that?
Well, if you go there, essentially, people are taxed more, and they have more common goods.
Right.
But you're still going around at a job, and you get paid, and you can't. It's not like you're going into the store just grabbing whatever you want, walking out.
But the question,
see you, Sven. No,
but the reason
you got to pay for it, right? And then the guy at the cash register is checking, did I make a profit here today?
Right, but the reason I'm asking that is because and maybe it's the words that fail us sometimes. I often, I'll talk to my friends about this. I go, it's interesting that we sort of stopped. Right. We went, there's socialism, there's there's the communism, there's capitalism, and then we just stopped. We're like, this is it, there's capitalism, and that's that. I sometimes wonder, is there not something better? Is there not something we could be moving towards?
I think there is.
Maybe I should be asking, what is inclusive capitalism?
The reason I just used, let's say, a Denmark as an example, is not because it's going to work perfectly in India, the United States, et cetera. The point, though, is they've got some blend, some mix.
Right.
Right? There is an advantage in terms of efficiency and also freedom to a market system.
Okay.
Right? You have a control system. Some guy in an office is deciding how many potatoes we're going to grow this year. That usually doesn't work.
Right.
The flip side of it is that what we've also learned is that if some guy in a boardroom is deciding I'm going to ravage the environment to do whatever I want, that doesn't work either.
Right.
So we're going to have a blend of some sort. We want some collective decision making about the social good, and we want something that's efficient and dynamic and allows us to exercise our innovation and freedom. And we don't need to worry so much about the labels as we do about being practical and thinking about what's working and what isn't.
All right. What do you think of Barack Obama's defense of the Capitol Order there?
So I feel like those like Barack Obama who kind of push for humanitarian capitalism are the worst hypocrites that we could have around, because I much prefer someone that explicitly tells you overtly how the system works instead of concealing how the system works, idealizing the system. And thus, in this way, really, it's the best way to just, in a way, hamper people's imagination for a different political future. So, first of all, the concept of freedom, and I also always enjoy that very much in the sense that it's actually, in my work, I show how economists in their economic models had a big role to play in kind of shaping the common sense imagination of this word freedom and how we understand it. Today, the idea is that freedom is fundamentally the freedom of the creditor investors, the freedom of the entrepreneur to do whatever they want with their cash. Now, the point is that this type of economic freedom that was so crucial in the economic models that were being created around the beginning of the 20th century and ultimately are still those that inform all these economic experts today, were the exact opposite understanding of economic freedom with respect to someone like, for example, Antonio Gramsci, who realized that market freedom of the saver investor presupposed the structural exploitation of the working classes. So the very fact that capital as money exists presupposes capital as a social relation by which the people work and do not hold on to what they produced, nor are they in charge of their economic activity while they're producing. And thus, in a way, it's generalized alienation that allows for the supposed freedom and efficiency. There's a lot to say also about the concept of efficiency because, it's very debatable how efficient our current economic system is. And efficient in itself is a very anachronistic term if you try to think about the deeper social problems that we're facing. Not only just the inequality, but the global climate catastrophe that clearly this very efficient system is not really able to cope with. Again, not because of bad intentions, but because the DNA of capitalism is about the profit motive, and in order protect it, you gotta have austerity. So this is the thing. The idea that we can have a reformed version of capitalism, I think, is quite utopian. And we have seen this historically, because basically, I would argue that even the 30 great years after the Second World War were much more austere than one would think. But so I would say that in general, the DNA of capitalism is austerity capitalism.
But that's why it's so interesting. Trevor Noah, I mean, he really gets in there and tries to walk him to it. And it's exactly what you were saying, that there was this, in some ways, this natural evolution of experimentation with different kinds of economic systems was abruptly brought to a halt very purposefully, right? And austerity is part of the measure that prevents the kinds of innovations that people were coming up with in the post-World War I period from advancing. And so Trevor Noah asked the question, sure, okay, let's say capitalism was an improvement on the mean. What's next? Shouldn't we be looking to the next thing? And Obama kind of pivots it to this idea that, well, sure, I guess there's some people who ruin the environment, and that the profit motive, he will acknowledge, yields these bad outcomes and negative externalities and inefficiencies. But the goal is to cure those inefficiencies, not to move on to the next thing. And he really puts the kibosh on Trevor Noah, I think, very eloquently for the mainstream TV standards, starting to explore what, at very least, the weight of these things should be. Should we be starting with the presumption towards socialism and the priorities that are inherent to that, or starting with the presumption of capitalism and curing the inefficiencies of that system? And the quickness with which Barack Obama pivoted away from even tipping a toe into that conversation, I think, speaks volumes about the role that austerity plays in the propaganda that most of us endure under.
Yes, that is for certainly the case. And there is, I think, though, we are at a moment in which the narrative by which capitalism is the only game in town is really breaking down. And that's why people like Barack Obama, that generation especially, is so steadfast attached to protecting it. But they realize that, words are not anymore weighty enough to defend the system. That's why you need to strike concretely with austerity policies. So in the capital order, I discuss how austerity is both about consensus building. So again, having us all think that, workers are lazy, that those at the top really deserve it. And so it's fair for resources to be shifted towards those who are actually the engine of the economic machine, those virtuous individuals. Well, of course, this is the complete opposite of another theoretical framework that would tell you that actually capitalist economic growth derives from structural exploitation, and it's actually the workers that produce value. And so they are at the center of the machine. But if this narrative consensus building isn't anymore working, and I think the newer generations are more and more skeptical, what we see today is clearly that our system is in a crisis that is quite existential in terms of its appeal to the new generations. At this point, though, you need the coercion bit. So austerity plays with this double strategy: consensus, coercion, and coercion comes in the form of increase of interest rates. Increases of interest rates will work as a disciplinary mechanism because people will be forced out of their jobs. Unemployment will create greater competition amongst workers, who will then have to accept lower wages, and in general will have to accept to go to work for a wage. While and the same happens with, if you cut social expenditures, you're increasing the dependence on the market of people, because while before maybe they could be entitled to healthcare or decent schooling just by the fact of being alive as citizens in the United States, we well know that this is not the case at all, because everything is commodified. Thus, you need money in order to purchase any basic service. And this is why you have to give in and accept to be subjugated to the capital order. But clearly, this generation of people is aware and worried, and that's why they dismiss any talk of alternatives. I went to a talk the other day. I was labeled as a romantic Marxist, and I told them, why do you give labels to people who just think slightly outside the box? I don't go around labeling everyone as a technocratic liberal because that's kind of the norm. Well, we should, right? But that's point is that. But I do think that this fact that they're so protective and they're so dismissive about alternatives speaks to a generalized crisis of their worldview that they are aware of. And this is why the Fed is not stopping with increases in interest rates, why Republicans have already said that they're going to curtail Medicaid and Medicare, and so on and so forth.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.